Chad, if I could ask you first to respond to the first question, which was what kind of government support in terms of policy implementation will allow firms to continue to effectively integrate sustainable strategies into their business models?
So we had a great table with an extremely good cross-section. We have 4 ideas you can go implement tomorrow, governments, if you'll just take them up on that, okay? So number 1 is governments set a ranking system of themselves on sustainability. So business can see exactly what the measures are. A very objective ranking system. Equally, governments set a ranking system of companies on sustainability, much like a credit rating system from S&P. And hopefully, if the system is right that these governments establish, then lending institutions will take that into account in their decisions. Other people will take it into account in the decisions, and it will make a difference. But the government could bring credibility to that. Number 2, governments require in reporting more future-looking and less looking back. And we realize that has legal implications, and we got to make sure it doesn't create lawsuit heaven. But if indeed we have more looking forward to risk, it's more meaningful from a government standpoint. 3, from a very different perspective, we were very enthusiastic about the role mayors can play. And we heard examples of mayors putting in incentives and taxes to reward good behavior locally. We thought that was a tremendous thing. And we concluded from that if we could have more training of mayors so they would know what tools work, was that bottom-up approach might make a lot of sense. And finally, more on a national level, if governments could look out and see best practices that have been adopted by leading companies and then make that the rule for everybody. We thought that would be a real plus to getting best practices adopted if they had a practice of doing that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So a lot from the government to create credibility, maybe train up mayors and learn from best practice. Thank you. Stanley, could I ask you to look at the second question, please? How can green innovation be incentivized to boost investment in sustainable business practices?
I think we had a number of very interesting ideas coming from a group that was fairly heavily weighted to natural resources and mining on our table. And I think one of the major issues that came out of that is an incentive to put in place the proper governance structures to deal with corruption. And dealing with corruption is a major driver to driving sustainability in some of the least developed areas of the world. A critical point that came up there was putting in structures as well for empowerment of women. Women, especially from the developing nations, can be driven as a force if they're empowered with ag development support, technology transfer, to empower these women to become part of those economies. A critical issue is looking at the SMEs and scaling up, giving incentives to scale up SMEs and developing collaborative frameworks between the large multinationals, potentially along their value chains and their supply chains, to support the SMEs in local environments. Another major factor in terms of incentives could be the issue of pre-competitive R&D, that especially if we're looking at capital-intensive areas, capital-intensive industry sectors, pre-competitive R&D structures and cross-sector R&D could be a major place to put in incentives. I think finally, just to round this off, the other issue is looking at natural capital, the value of externalities, how these are costed and how these are rewarded. And one example that I put across on this, I represent in many ways the Brazilian forestry sector, is the Brazilian forestry sector is forced to put aside 20 to 30% of its land as biodiversity preservation. This is an externality that is costed into Brazilian production, and yet Brazilian forestry production still remains the most competitive in the world. So these models are possible and are capable. Thank you.
So very interesting. So there are models existing today that put value on natural capital but don't undermine the competitiveness of the industry.
Absolutely.
That's well worth taking away, I think. And finally, Peter, if I could ask you to deal with the third question we had on the tables. How can sustainability best be integrated into emerging markets in order to promote the economic and the social growth of developing countries?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say we had a very interesting table, a little bit more influenced by consumer goods and service companies and then intergovernmental agencies. I thought we finally came to the conclusion the most important issue would be transparency. Whatever is happening, we have to get more transparency into this process. I think, unfortunately, the Doha round collapsed. I say unfortunately because it was replaced by an enormous amount of bilateral agreements, which of course act exactly against transparency, and therefore we are not very happy about this. And it also acted on an increased trade protectionism. And therefore, I think one of the things we really feel if there was any chance to get this back, this would be very helpful in order to get sustainability back into the emerging markets. The second aspect was the role of the financial sector. The new finance regulations, Basel III specifically, are not very helpful, frankly speaking, in order to get financing for long-term sustainable investments, especially in the emerging countries. One of the first projects which are being taken off of the books in order to bring the risk-weighted assets down is normally long-term investments into sustainable projects. The public policies are sending wrong signals. For example, too ambitious goals can have a negative impact, and we discussed about biofuels, for example. I mean, the negative impact of the subsidies of biofuel, 22 billion being spent, not necessarily the right direction. How to integrate sustainability into the emerging markets more? I think, first of all, we need to have transparent guidelines. I think the ICC guidelines, which have just been published and which are integrating the aspect of sustainability, is a good example. We still believe that the voluntary business approach, which is the corporate social responsibility, which has evolved by many companies to the concept of creating shared value, is a good one. Then the great institutional framework, which emphasizes the bottom-up approach, which means that what this framework has to do is to protect the small farmers, for example, the small businesses in the markets, and not only the big ones. And then the price of environmental externalities should be really openly charged to the consumer and not to the producer. And the radical idea which you have been asking for, I would say, came from one of our table members who is running a very important consumer good company. And he said he will show publicly in the future the cost of environmental externalities to the consumers by indicating the price I sell you this product is 100, but if I really would charge all the environmental cost, this product should be costing 105 or 120. It was somewhere between 5 to 20% more expensive. And to start to educate the consumer, who for the time being is not willing to really assume the cost of these environmental externalities.
So much like at the moment, many foods have the calorific value, you could have the environmental externality cost on the package as well.
Exactly on the label.
What a great idea. Gentlemen, did either of you have a radical idea on your table to pick up on the theme of the last panel?
Our table had many radical ideas. We reported on most of them. But the one idea was we have 50,000 people in this town today talking about this subject, but we don't have much in common. So the idea is, this is radical, that we create an entity, call it a corporation, and everybody has to buy $10 worth of stock and use those funds for something we all work on together rather than working against everything. Might create a different atmosphere.
I love that. The only thing is I think it should be $100, not 10. Great idea. We could raise some money and do something. Lovely.
I think from our group, the feeling was we don't need radical ideas. We need to implement what we actually have. Okay. And I think two key things that came out of that. One is the word harnessing, that we need to harness together different sectors, different fields, and we could possibly use that $100 contribution to look at how we harness that all together. And I would make one last point on this, is that we need to develop models that are agnostic to the source of innovation, but know how to use and apply that innovation in different environments. And I think if we can do that, then we can really push this to the limit.
So it's not so much about the new radical, it's taking what we've already got and scaling it and learning from examples.
And applying it where it needs to be applied.
Perfect. And in the few minutes we've got left, if I could just ask you the same question that I asked the previous panel. I hope you had a mix of business, civil society and government on your table. Was there a sense of collaboration or was there any sense of conflict?
We had only collaboration. There was no conflict.
No conflict at all. Fantastic.
I think everyone has realized the time has come that we need to put in place new collaborative frameworks. Otherwise, we're going to have a very sick planet.
We had great collaboration, but we hit a point that we thought was very important, and that because business is becoming leaders, especially the businesses that are here, are leaders, we're taking the role governments were playing 20 years ago in leadership, and we need to be sure we bring the citizens along with us when we're doing that.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. So I hope you had a good debate on your table. I hope that some of those thoughts represented what was discussed on your tables. The table chairs have been asked to complete the sheets. Please leave them on the table and they'll be collected at the end. Just to wrap on that session, I heard quite a lot about the role of government in actually taking a lead on some things and then sharing it back. I heard a lot about helping the small guys, the SMEs, the small farmers, build up and scale with the help of the large corporates. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand back to Chris for the last 3 minutes. If I could ask you for respect, please. Thank you. Is that all right?
Thank you, Malcolm, and thanks to every one of you for participating wholeheartedly. Thanks for the reporters. It was wonderful to hear the comments. I'm not going to summarize at this point because we have afternoon, a full afternoon. There is cross-sectoral panels which is going to meet in different rooms. I encourage every one of you to participate in those, and we'll come back in the evening, and we'll have the closing plenary at that point. So the lunch is officially over. Thank you very much for participating.